High noon on the Llano Estacado, 1874. Heat quivers over a salt flat like glass, held to a fire. A broken freight wagon lies at an angle, one wheel swallowed by a ring of slow-breathing quicksand. Vultures coast in tight black spirals. Wind drives sand through split mesquite, whispering like a saw over bone. Mara Vale, a 26-year-old widowed teacher, has been sold to settle a fake debt after refusing the ranch heir who stranded her, gagged and bound with a rough sack over her head at a back of beyond way station. She hears men bargaining her life for a sack of flour, a jug, and a rifle. Alone, bruised, and dazed from fainting hunger, she clutches in her tied hands a small leather medicine pouch she swore never to surrender. The only thing left from the night she midwifed a stranger's dying wife on the trail. At dusk, when the sack is torn away, the rider who has arrived to claim the sale does not reach for his knife. He falls to his knees in the dust and speaks a name Mara has never heard. Before we go further, look closely at the undertaker's ledger margin from that way station. The single erased word beside "one woman exchanged" is the key to why a Comanche chief knelt in the dust at sundown. The way station sat crouched against the flats like a tired animal. One long room of rough planks, a lean-to shed, a low corral, a cracked rain barrel that hadn't seen a storm in months. The sign above the door was a plank with a dark ring where a coffee pot once hung. Inside, it smelled of dust, old bacon, harness soap, and the dry, sour tang of spilled rye. Men came through for water, for gossip, for the luxury of a roof. Drovers stood in the shade with their hats pulled low and their spurs dull with use. Two ranch hands in Crowley colors lounged near the hitch rail, boots crossed, watching the corral gate like it might suddenly open and spill money. The sheriff leaned against the door frame with his thumbs hooked in his belt, a smile that showed no teeth, and a tin star polished more than his conscience. His name was Amos Pike, and he'd learned long ago that paper cut deeper than any knife if you wrote the right words on it. Mara's world was cotton and heat, and the scratch of rope at her wrists. The sack was rough as a feed bag and tasted like old flour and sweat. She breathed through it because that was what survival was now, counting breaths. Under the rope, her fingers worried at the little leather medicine pouch. She knew every bead by touch. She had held it once in a storm that made the sky green and pulled a baby from a dying woman whose face she could no longer remember. She had tied that pouch closed when the child stopped breathing, when the husband's hawk-dark eyes turned to glass, and she had told herself she would find him and return it. She had told herself the land would deliver a chance. The land had delivered a sack over her head and men arguing over her price. Silas Crowley arrived late, like men who know others will wait. He swung down from a good horse with a silver concho bridle and dusted his sleeves with the backs of his hands. He was not tall, but he took up space, the way a fire takes a room. He nodded at Amos, who lifted his chin back and lifted one hand toward the undertaker inside. Jonah Pike sat at a small table just inside the door, with a ledger in front of him, a stub pen in his fingers, an ink bottle with a cork stopper. He had the weary face of a man who has watched too many people become lines on a page. The ledger lay open to a half-filled page where the last neat entry read, "Mules, Team, Sorrel, $30. The next line had only a date and a long blank, waiting to be made official. Silas did not look at Mara. He looked at the small crowd and at the sheriff and at the straight and hungry horizon beyond the corral rails. "You kept her quiet," he said, as if he were proud of a hired hand's work. His voice was smooth and dried at the edges. "I appreciate proper dealings." "Proper's what the paper says it is," Amos said. He took a folded sheet from his vest and shook it once, so it snapped. "Debt recognized. Room, board, and damages to Mr. Crowley's property." When the lady refused his good-willed protection, the men chuckled. They were careful to leave a little space between themselves and the sheriff's words, like men edging away from a skunk's tail, but not quite willing to admit they smelled anything. Mara listened and let each word fall past her. She could not afford fury. Fury would make her struggle against the rope and struggle wasted breath. She counted the knots under her fingers on the pouch. 1, 2. The third knot was odd, a little tighter, like it had been cinched by a hand that shook. The woman had shaken in the storm. The husband had held the lantern. "Push now," Mara had said, and the woman had bled warm across her wrists. And then the baby had cried once and gone quiet. A thin cry still threaded the memory. She held to that sound now. "Payment," Silas said. He lifted a hand and one of his men set a sack on the table. Flour slumped it flat. Another man set a brown jug with a corncob stopper. A third laid a rifle longwise, oiled wood, blued barrel, as arranged. Jonah looked at the items, at the space they took up, at the value of them as marks in ink. He wet the pen tip, touched it to the top line beneath the date, and wrote, the nib scratching faint as a cricket. One woman, exchange. He paused after exchange, the pen tip hanging there, uncertain. A fly walked across the ledger margin and changed direction, where the page buckled slightly from old damp. Jonah's throat moved. His eyes flicked toward the sheriff. Amos was watching him, and his smile had grown wider. "Buyer," Amos said. Jonah set the pen down and reached for the little blade he kept to sharpen it. He shaved the nib so it would write a clean line. He touched the pen back down and began the B and stopped again. Perhaps the heat, perhaps the fly, perhaps the way Mara, sack-headed and bound, shifted her fingers just enough for a glint of bead to show where the rope had chewed through her shirt cuff. Jonah saw the glint, and for a moment he thought of his own mother's rosary, the beads clicking in a dark house in a year of fever. He wrote B, and then pressed the pen so hard it blotted. Then he reached for the pumice stone he used when he made mistakes. He rubbed the fresh ink away, careful, and the paper furred and thinned where the letter had been. He blew the dust from the page and penned a tiny cross in the margin, like men do when they are afraid to leave a space empty. "Write it, Jonah," Amos said. Jonah dipped the nib again. He wrote, "By order of sheriff." He left the buyer line blank. Silas laughed softly. "Paper's still paper," he said. He reached out and with one finger tapped the butt of the rifle. "It speaks well enough for anyone who wants to argue." He looked toward the corral. "Lift the sack," he said. "Let's see what we bought." "No need," Amos answered. "The buyer can see at sundown." He turned and looked across the flats where the light was going dull, as if a hand were lowering it. They wanted to be here when the sun as good as gives up. Mara heard that. They wanted. Her chest tightened with a new kind of fear. Not Silas. Someone else. Someone who had arranged this like a supper. She hated that her mind jumped to hope. At the same moment it twisted in dread. She had learned the hard way that hope and dread wore the same boots when they walked up to your door. She breathed and counted the breath and counted the beads. 1, 2, 3. The odd knot. She moved her fingers to the edge of the pouch so the rope hit it again. She remembered the husband's eyes, the hawk dark ring in them, the way he had not cried, that not crying had burned into her. She had promised in the rain to return what his wife had pressed into her palm. The promise had not brought him, only the sack had. The sun bled into the rim. The wind dropped. Sound came thin and far, as if the world were a room and someone had stepped just outside and closed the door behind him. Hooves came through the heat hush. A line of riders cut black against the red sky, as if scissored out of paper. They rode slow. They rode like men who knew that to rush a moment is to break it. At their head was a man on a dun horse with a rawhide hackamore and a hair rope, no iron showing. He wore his hair in 2 braids wrapped in fur. A long scar slid from his jaw down into his collarbone. His face did not change as the sheriff stepped forward. His name moved among the crowd like a breath. Tall Wolf. Amos raised a hand as if to welcome a guest to a harvest table. "Evening," he said. "We kept our word." Tall Wolf swung down without looking at him. He looked at the bound figure beside the corral post, at the way the EA rope cut the skin under the sack. He did not move yet. He listened to the wind, or to something standing inside it. Then he nodded to a rider behind him. The rider stepped forward and cut the rope at Mara's ankles with a flake of stone. The stone whispered. The crowd held still because the horses held still, and because something new, old as flint and bone, had entered the space. The sack lifted. Hot air slapped Mara's face, and she sucked it in like a drowning swimmer whose head finds the surface. She blinked. Sand grit her eyes. The world came in colors. Red sky, dun horse, dark braids, the sheriff's vest, Silas's smile, the undertaker's pale hands. Then the man on the dun took a step toward her and stopped, as if he had run into a wall no one could see. His face folded and broke in a way she did not understand. He dropped to his knees in the dust, with a sound like something unstrung, and he said a name she had never heard, soft, as if saying it could set a bone that had gone crooked. Atsika. The men shifted like cattle that smell lightning. Silas straightened, his smile gone. Amos's hand dropped toward the butt of his pistol and stopped at his belt buckle, and his thumb rubbed the metal like a charm. Jonah looked down at the ledger on the table and saw the erasure fur go gray where the breeze lifted it. Mara stared at the kneeling man. His eyes were the hawk dark from the storm. The pouch in her hands felt suddenly heavy, hot, alive. She called you that, Tall Wolf said, but he said it in his own tongue. And then he spoke in broken English for those who had made English into a club. She called you midwife. The word fell flat. It should have been a word for a warm place, a lamp, a low song. It fell like a dry stick. She is ours, Silas said, and his voice was bright in the sudden hush. He admits it. He said it. You all heard. She belongs to them by their own talk. Mara felt the circle shift. A thing can happen many ways and still come to the same end. If the crowd told itself she belonged to Tall Wolf, if the sheriff wrote the right words, then she was no longer a woman to be counted. She was a line item to be moved across a page until the hand holding the pen tired. She did the only thing she had left. She lifted her bound hands and showed the pouch. This, she said, and her voice carried clean because the wind held its breath. This came from your wife. She did not know if the grammar was right. She did not know if the word for wife struck a wound or a kindness. She said it anyway. Tall Wolf's head came up like a hunting bird's. He was on his feet in a clean rising line, and his hand touched the pouch, not like a man claiming a thing, but like a man touching the edge of a cliff where someone had fallen and where the land still remembered the shape of a body. He did not take it. He put his hand to his chest instead. Dead of breath, he said. Amos saw his moment going fog-soft. He clapped his hands once. No debt counts against county order, he said. We have soldiers who will clarify matters for those who think blood makes a better argument than paper. He lifted his chin and listened. The sound came then, thin at first, then clear. Bugles from the ridge where the road met the horizon. Men always felt braver when brass made noise for them. The drovers turned their heads like sunflowers turning toward the sound. Silas smiled again. It was a smaller smile now, cut tight, but it was a smile. Tall Wolf looked past Mara to the red horizon, and then at the faces that had arranged her life on a table. He raised one hand. His riders moved as if they were one body, and the crowd eased back without knowing they had done it. We take her, he said. She is under my feet. He meant protection. He meant the ground he stood upon extended its circle around her. Amos opened his mouth. Tall Wolf cut him off with his gaze. This paper, he said, and his mouth turned around the unfamiliar shape. It is a lie. That right there is slander, Amos said, but his drawl got thinner because he had seen men stand quiet before, and it had never looked like this. His hand drifted again and stopped again on his belt buckle. Mara did not wait for the next trick. She walked. It was not brave. It was not clever. It was only the body knowing where it should be before the mind could argue. She walked to the dun horse and the man who had said a name, like a prayer, over a grave. She stood beside him and looked toward the ridge. The bugles called again. The note bounced off the flats and came back smaller, like a lie told twice. They moved at a walk first, the Comanche riders folding around her with a quiet that felt like a blanket, not like a trap. The crowd at the way station let them go, because crowds do not move unless someone moves first, and the soldiers' music made them think someone else would do the work of stopping what had begun. Silas called out once, "You'll answer for this." and his voice came out high and thin, and then went away in the wind. Kona rode behind Mara, close enough to cut the rope at her wrists with the same flake of stone. The rope snapped like a dry twig. Pain stung Mara's hands where the blood came back. She did not drop the pouch. She would not drop it if her hands turned to ash. She thought she might faint. She did not faint. She counted the breaths. She raised her eyes to the Dun's ears and counted the flicks. She counted to keep the world in one piece. They did not ride far. The flat took them until the dark came deep enough that the horizon lost its color and the land took back its heat. They turned into a shallow wash where wind had carved the ash rock into soft shapes, like old bones. Here, voices sounded different, as if the rock had been listening for a long time and had learned how to hold grief without spilling it. Fires were small and built low. Water passed from hand to hand. Small sips, careful, as if each swallow had a name on it. Tall Wolf motioned, and they sat. He did not sit high or apart. He sat in the dust, like anyone who had been taught by the land that it flattens every back the same. He told the story then, not to convince the white men, not to win anything from paper, but because the story had to be put back where it belonged. The words were few, and the spaces between them did the heavier lifting. There had been a night with a sky so thick with boiling light that the color had a taste. There had been a woman whose breath came like torn cloth. There had been a midwife with hands that knew roads inside a body. There had been a baby's cry, and then silence. There had been a pouch pressed into a stranger's palm, because the dying have a right to ask a thing. There had been a promise to repay a debt that was not money. Mara answered with a few words of her own. She told him the child had cried once, and then gone still. She told him his wife had held that sound in her face, like someone lifting a cup and finding it empty. She told him the wind had turned warm, sudden, and everything smelled of iron. Tall Wolf did not move. Kona's chin lifted, a fraction. Someone behind them made the low sound people make when a thing you thought wrong has been named right and cannot hurt you in the same way anymore. The night brought a little air. In that breath of cool, the land felt less like an enemy and more like a judge who had yet to speak. Mara's body ached where the rope had been. She drank water, and for the first time that day, she did not count the swallow. She learned Kona's name because it was said once, and a name carried this far, and no farther, was a kind of trust. She watched the riders put their hands over the fire to feel the heat, and then draw them back without shaking them. Control mattered here. Words mattered more than a show of them. At the mission, miles off, a woman with quick hands and a face lined by both kindness and hard decisions slid a key into a drawer in a table and locked it. Sister Honora Byrne touched the smooth wood and felt the ghost of a groove where a quill had scratched it years ago. She had been keeping the parish register since the priest died of fever. She had learned that writing a name in a book could save a soul from being mislaid. She had also learned that sometimes a name on a page could put a living body into a hole in the ground quicker than fever could. There was a page in the register where the fibers were thinned. The surname was scraped, delicately, with a little knife she kept in her apron, the same knife she used to spare infants from tight cords. She had done it in a dark moment when she believed that cutting a name was the same as cutting a rope. She was not sure now. Doubt lived under her scapular, like a thorn. She told herself aloud, some truths must ride a little farther. The room did not argue with her. Silas Crowley, whose truths never rode farther than his own fence line, sat at a table under a lamp and wrote a notice with long, straight lines. Raid warning, it said at the top, though no raiding had happened yet. He named the Widow's Eye Spring because water turned men into wolves. He named Mara Vale on a line without her name on it, by using only her initials. He had learned from Amos how to name someone without writing them down. He folded the paper and sealed it with a smear of wax and sent a boy to the fort with it. He did not pay the boy much. He slept well. Men like him often do, until the last week of their lives. Jonah Pike sat with his ledger and touched the furred patch with the pad of his thumb until it warmed. He had done wrong by omission his whole life. That was the shape of his sin. He did not raise a hand to hit. He did not carry a match to a church. He watched, and he wrote, and he told himself it was not his place to stand in front of anyone else's fate. Tonight, the thin place on the page bothered him the way an open mouth bothers a man in a room where someone has just died. He dipped the pen and drew a tiny cross in the margin, smaller than a fly's foot, the mark he made when he needed the Lord to see something he didn't yet have words for. The ink looked like a mole on pale skin. He put sand on it so it would dry. He blew and watched the grains jump and fall. By morning, the flats had cooled enough to pretend at kindness. Mara stood and found she could straighten her back without the light going white. Kona handed her a strip of dried meat and watched how she took it. Tall Wolf spoke little. When he did, it was about water and how people who forgot their duty to it died loud. He wanted to show the belly of the land where it kept its last bottles. He wanted to keep moving because bugles did not sleep. Mara went with them because to stay was to be owned by a sheriff's paper. They crossed a shallow canyon so narrow the sun could not find its floor at noon. Devil's Slot, Kona called it. At the lip, Tall Wolf stopped and said something, a set of syllables that made the others nod. Kona held out a coal cupped in a shard of pottery. Carry to the other side without killing it, she said, simple. If it lives, you can walk with us. If it dies, you turn back. Mara looked at the coal. It glowed small and steady as a child's eye under a blanket. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to cry. She did neither. She took the coal in both hands. The shard was hot, but the heat did not frighten her. Heat had been life in the cabins of her teaching years. She stepped onto the ledge. The rock underfoot was slick with the powder of 1,000 small collapses. A wind rose inside the slot canyon and spun up grit that stung her calves. She bent into it and counted her steps. She kept the shard tilted away. Dust devils peered over the rim like animals that had smelled a traveler carrying bread. Her breath ran short, but she did not hurry. Hurrying is what breaks things. Halfway, a narrow place forced her to turn the shard sideways, and the coal's glow thinned. She blew on it, and the ember brightened. Hungry little thing. She came down on the other side with her hands shaking and put the shard on a flat stone. The ember was still alive. Kona looked at her, and something long practiced and guarded in the girl's face loosened by a stitch. They moved again, and the day lay low and close, hot as a held breath. In town, Amos nailed a notice to a post where everyone had to pass. Anyone aiding the sack woman will be fined, it said, and someone had drawn a crude shape that might have been a witch or might have been a woman in a sack. Men laughed at the drawing without laughing at what it meant. People do that when they want to be less ashamed of themselves. At the fort, a young sergeant read Silas's raid notice frowning. He had the kind of frown that belongs to someone who can still be surprised by another man's handwriting. He took it to Lieutenant Merritt Sloan, who had learned to put arrows on maps faster than he put meat in his mouth. Sloan saw what he wanted in the notice, a problem his orders could solve. He pinned new arrows toward Widow's Eye and wrote, MV, Asset for Hostility. He did not write her name. He did not need to. The map looked cleaner without it. Jonah, who had never broken a law on purpose, broke one now. He went to the mission in the hot blue hour before noon, when no one wanted to walk. He asked for Sister Honora, and took off his hat the way men do in houses they respect, without quite trusting. He held his ledger like a child. Sister, he said, and his voice sounded like a hinge that had not been oiled in years. There's a place I thinned a page. I need to know if your book has a place like that. Honora did not ask why. She took him into the back room, where the parish register lay, like a sleeping thing under a cloth. She opened it to the page she had not looked at in months, and traced the scraped line with her nail. Jonah put his ledger beside it. The two thin places on two different books lay together like mismatched scars. They did not look the same. They were the same kind of wound. Honora looked at Jonah and he looked at her, and both of them understood there are times when two small people are all the law anyone is going to get. At dawn on the third day, A wagon with a white cloth, raised over it like a truce flag, rolled down into the wash, where Tall Wolf's people had camped. Sister Honora set the brake herself and climbed down, her skirts dusty to the knee. She lifted a wrapped parcel from the wagon bed. It was a canvas packet, tied with string and sealed with a wax stamp she had pressed with a coffee spoon when the coroner's official seal could not be found. Coroner, provisional, she had written on it in her careful schoolgirl letters that the world judged and also relied upon. She looked at Mara and did not speak, because speaking would empty her, and she needed all of herself. She looked at Tall Wolf and bowed her head 1 inch. In the notch of the canyon, a bird called once, and then went away from the sound of its own call, as if not wanting to be counted in what was about to happen. Someone had followed the wagon. You felt him before you saw him. The wash held its breath in a new way. Kona stiffened, and her hand slid along the shaft of the arrow she kept near, because you did not leave your hand too long away from a thing you might need. Jonah, who had come behind Honora on a borrowed mule, turned and saw the slope above them, where a small cluster of stones that had not been there yesterday, and that were not stones now. The cluster moved, and the sun struck iron, and the shape of a man stood out of the stones, with a rifle already at his shoulder. "Law," he called down, which was a word men used when they wanted to cut a line in the dirt and tell other men where to stand, so it would be easier to kill them. By order of Lieutenant Sloan, anyone in this camp is to surrender arms, and the woman called MV. His voice trembled on the initials. He had not wanted to say them out loud, and then he had done, and they had tasted like someone else's spit on his tongue. Tall Wolf stood slowly. He put his knife on the ground in front of him, point toward himself, to show what a weapon looked like without a hand. "We speak first," he said. "Then we see who is brave." Sloane's scout licked his lips and shifted his stance and glanced to the west, where, far off, a bugle would soon tear another strip from the air. He did not fire yet. Honora laid the canvas packet on a flat rock and set a palm on it like a woman steadying a child in a wagon. "This is for a tent," she said, low, to Jonah and Mara, and to the air that always carries words farther than you'd think. "A coroner's tent, where paper can be read without guns repeating it." Mara held the pouch and felt the beads cool under her fingers, now that the morning had come. She watched the scout above them and thought of the undertaker's ledger, and the parish register, and the ink-sick erasure, and the tiny cross in the margin, and the way paper, for all its weakness, could sometimes stand taller than a man with a rifle when someone brave held it high at the right moment. She did not know if that moment would be given. She planned for it anyway. That is another way of saying she chose to live. From the ridge the bugle rose again. It came louder this time, a bright tear ripping down toward the wash. Dust plumed along the road. Horses cut the horizon into beautiful, terrible shapes. Kona leaned toward Mara and let a breath whisper through her teeth. "We move now," she said, "or we bleed where we sleep." The line was not poetry. It was a measure. They moved. The camp broke into small pieces that could travel faster than any one body. Men and women, and a boy with a bundle tied with hide thongs. They moved toward the mouth of the wash, where low brush could hide a person, the way a mother can hide a child behind her skirts, without anyone else seeing that the child is there. Tall Wolf motioned, and 2 riders slipped out over the rim to draw a line in the dust that would look like a bigger force moving elsewhere. Mara stayed with Honora and Jonah and the packet on the rock. The scout on the slope barked another command he did not believe. Amos Pike appeared beside him, like a man only paper could conjure, his star bright, his belt buckle brighter, his eyes bloodshot with the rush that comes when a coward thinks he might survive by yelling loudly near brave men. Silas Crowley was not yet in sight, but his notice had run ahead of him like a thin fire on dry grass. The first soldier in the leading file rode into view, where the wash met the open flat. His face was young and already hard as a baked brick left too long in a kiln. Sloane rode behind him, eyes on the land as if the land, not the people on it, were his enemy. He raised his hand to halt, and the column checked in a ripple. He gave the little nod men give when they tell themselves the story of what comes next, so the story will not be able to tell itself without them. And then, a small thing happened that did not feel small. A wind passed across the flats and down into the wash and rolled over the canvas packet on the rock. The string lifted and rattled light against the wax. The stamp looked like a coin you had not noticed in the dirt until the sun made it wink. Sloane saw the packet. He saw the word coroner, even from where he sat, because the letters were clean and dark and straight. A coroner is a different kind of trumpet. It blows in a different register. It speaks to men who like maps, and to men who keep ledgers, and to nuns who keep registers, and to chiefs who keep debts of breath. Sloane hesitated the way a horse hesitates at a cattle guard. Somewhere behind him, a vulture tilted its wing to turn, and the shade of it crossed his face for the space of a heartbeat. Silas chose that heartbeat to come into view at a gallop, dust up to his saddle skirts, hat pulled low, mouth open on a shout that would paper over any doubt. "Arrest her," he cried, and he pointed past everyone else at Mara, like a finger bone pointing out of a grave. "She's mine by law." He had no paper in his hand. His law lived in the shout. It was a thin law. It only worked when other men were tired or scared. The wash held everyone tight. The wind died again and left the shape of the bugles hanging across the air like loops of wire too high to cut. Mara stepped forward, and the world, for one little second, narrowed to her hand, and the beaded pouch, and the canvas packet, and the undertaker's ledger she could not carry, and the parish register page that lived under a nun's heart. She did what the shape of the moment asked. She put her palm on the packet, and the pouch on top of it, beads against canvas, breath debt against cause of death, the soft touch of leather against the hard seal of wax. She raised her head and let her voice be as simple as a schoolteacher calling children to their slates. "Read first," she said, "then decide." Men with horses and rifles do not like being told to read in front of other men. Some do. Some turn to the page and are grateful their shame has been replaced by another thing. Sloane looked at Amos. Amos looked at Silas. Silas looked at the rifle in the young sergeant's hands, like a man measuring a stair that might be too high to step without falling. The sergeant did a small thing with his fingers on the stock, a tightening, a loosening, a tightening. Papers had made him live as much as guns had. "Lieutenant," the sergeant said, and his voice broke itself into two pieces and then came together again. "If there's a coroner's notice, we are to secure the scene first." He had been taught that. He was not sure this was a scene and not a life, but the words had the ring of metal. Sloane swung down. He did it with pride because pride held him up when certainty faltered. He took 3 steps forward. Tall Wolf, who had not picked up his knife, lifted his chin a fraction. Silas opened his mouth, and Jonah Pike, who had spent a life recording, found his voice, of all the people, and put it out into the air to be counted. "There's a ledger," he said, loud enough to cross to Sloane, and to the scout on the slope, and to the men on horses, and to the nun with the packet, and to the woman with the pouch. "There's a ledger that says what was traded, and there's a place where I erased who took the trade. I will write it back if I live another hour." His words landed like nails in new wood. They did not move. The bugle lifted again, right over them, a brassy scream. It cracked the heat into plates. It made Silas's horse toss its head and sidestep and grind a hoof down into a little plant, as if killing it meant something. It made Amos flinch and put his hand to his star, to steady it, the way a drunk steadies himself on a wall. It made the scout on the slope think of a time when he had been a boy, and his sister had told him to do the right thing, and he had done not the right thing, and had not slept easy for many nights. The wash was about to break, like a dam. People would run and be dragged back, and the dust would fill with the sound of 100 choices happening at once. The white cloth of the wagon's truce flapped and then held. In the east, the sun reached the edge of a thin cloud and stepped behind it, like a man thinking better of his entrance and waiting one extra breath to walk into a room where everyone already knew his name. Sloane's boots made a dry sound on the wash floor. Not dust, but the sound of something worn thin. He stopped at the rock where the canvas packet sat with the beaded pouch on top. He looked at the seal, then at the faces around him, then at his sergeant. He had learned to keep his jaw tight when unsure. He did it. Now, secure the area, he said, and that could have meant many things. The sergeant took it to mean keep everyone from shooting at once. He lifted a hand and the line behind him settled, horses breathing hard like men trying not to speak. Sister Honora stepped closer. Her hands were steady, because she had kept 1,000 hands steady that wanted to fly. Lieutenant, she said, level and plain. This is a coroner's packet. It concerns a woman who died in childbirth on the trail. It names a witness by description. It mentions a beaded pouch like the one under your eyes. What you decide to do will be written after this page, but this page exists first. She did not raise her voice. Quiet made men lean in. Leaning in made them listen. Sloan broke the seal with the tip of his knife. It cut the wax clean in two. He lifted the string and opened the folds. The paper inside had gone soft at the corners, where many hands had touched it, then folded it away again, as if no one had wanted to be the last voice on the matter. He read. He did not read aloud. His eyes moved, left to right, and a muscle in his cheek jumped when it came to the line that said, "Unidentified woman expired following delivery. Infant expired minutes later. Presence noted of a midwife's voice. Accent not local. Witness did not give name. Distinctive small leather pouch with beadwork placed into midwife's hands by decedent." He looked at Mara. He looked at Tall Wolf. He looked at the pouch again. Behind him, Amos Pike shifted like a man with a pebble in his boot, and no chance to take his boot off. Silas broke the pause before the truth could settle anywhere. "This proves nothing," he said. "Lots of leather pouches. Lots of babies die. My notice says raiders have been moving at night. The woman is a lure. The nun is their cloak. The undertaker is their pen." He had a gift for making every word he touched smaller. Jonah took one step and felt his heart beat against his ribs, like something wanting out. "The ledger says different," he said. "I wrote one woman, exchange. I rubbed out the buyer. I put a cross by it. I can put the name back." He could feel the ledger in his hands, even though it was still at the mission under a plank in the floor, where he had tucked it before following Honora. Sloan folded the paper and slipped it back into the packet. "We will pitch a tent," he said. "The coroner's tent. We will set the papers side by side. We will take depositions. We will not move until the sun is lower." It was not mercy. It was a man buying time in the only currency he trusted, process. They stretched canvas between two stunted mesquites at the lip of the wash. The tent made a small square of shade and importance. Inside, a camp table, 2 stools, a canteen, a Bible, and the packet. Sloan sat with his back to the light so he could see the ink lines balk at the shadow when he read them. Sister Honora and Jonah stood opposite. Mara was allowed inside because she had the pouch, and because Tall Wolf stepped to the doorway once and stood there long enough that no one told her to leave. Amos hovered like a fly that would not set itself down where a hand could swat it. Silas waited outside, restless as a horse whose ground tie is thin. Sloan read the coroner's line again. He read Jonah's ledger entry with the blank buyer and the tiny cross. He read the notice Amos had nailed in town, his own arrows on the map, and Silas's raid warning. The paper weight grew until it was heavier than the rifles lined along the wash lip. He took up a blank sheet and dipped a pen in ink and wrote the heading, "Deposition of Sheriff Amos Pike." He looked at Amos. "Tell me the manner of sale," he said. Amos smiled and started smooth. "Rescue," he said. "The lady was in distress and placed in temporary protective custody, then, per county custom, transferred to the care of Mr. Crowley for safekeeping and provision pending court." Honora coughed once. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be. "You read the ledger," she said to Sloan, not to Amos. "You read the line." "Amend," Sloan said to Amos. Amos's smile got sticky. He swallowed. An exchange was made at the way station for items, pending the lady's own consent at a later time. "Pending whose consent?" Jonah asked. It came out softer than he meant. It carried more weight because of that. Amos glared at him, as if a cousin's gaze were a betrayal more shameful than his own words. "I do not recall the phrasing," he said. Sloane's pen paused. He had been a man who believed that if you asked enough times, the truth would appear because men were not clever enough to lie the same way twice. He looked at the erasure on Jonah's page and at the scrape on Honora's. 2 different hands. One kind of fear. He wrote, seller, unknown, buyer, name erased, sheriff's roll, intermediary. He hated the way the word intermediary felt like a fence not yet finished. Outside the tent, Kona watched the soldiers drink and try not to look at the camp they feared and were hungry to see. She watched Silas pace. She listened to the low talk of Tall Wolf and 2 elders as they spoke of water. Widow's Eye was a spring that made a circle of green when the world went brown. You could dig a well lower down and still pull sweet water if you did not gouge the earth in anger. Water was law older than any paper. Water remembered who had broken it. Kona ran a finger over a notch in her bow and thought of Mara. The woman had carried a coal across the devil's slot and kept it alive. That counted. Near midday, a child coughed in the camp, a deep, dry bark that had weight to it. Mara heard it through the tent cloth. Her feet moved before her thought did. She stepped to the doorway and looked to Tall Wolf, asking with her eyes. He tilted his head once. She crossed to a small shade lean-to where a boy lay, with hot cheeks and a stare that would not focus. She knelt, touched his forehead, and felt heat jump to her fingers. She asked for water and a clean cloth. She stripped the cloth and weighted it on his chest. She talked low to him of slates and letters and the notches on the pew, where the sun struck at 10 each morning. That regular. She laughed once and it sounded strange to her own ears. And then right. The boy blinked. It was a small thing. It was the shape of living. Sloane saw her kneel, and for a moment something old and unfashionable moved inside him. Something like respect, something like memory of a mother, setting a cool cloth on his head when the fever had taken him after a wet night picket. He set his jaw and went back to the line he was writing. Witness MV, present under protection of Tall Wolf. He had never written a line like that. He had written lines about hostiles and neutral parties and assets. Protection did not sit easily under his hand. Silas did not care for any of it. He walked away from the tent, away from the shade, away from the witness of clean paper. He found Amos out of earshot and spoke fast. "We can't let paper decide this," he said. "By the time ink dries, they'll be gone to Widow's Eye and dug in. And you know as well as I do once they drink there, you do not move them without a trail of dead that will sour our name for a decade." He did not say whose name. He did not need to. Amos knew his own kind of sour. "We go tonight," Silas said. "Take a few hands and a bottle and a length of chain. We pull her from their sleep and fix it quick with a preacher if we must. Paper looks different once a thing is sanctified." Amos looked toward the tent, toward his signature drying on a line that admitted more than he had planned to admit. He thought of powder and of being first to shoot. He did not enjoy either. "Not with soldiers looking," he said. "Then not here," Silas snapped. "At Widow's Eye. They will go there. They must. I'll be waiting. I'll count it a rescue. You can count it anything you want." Amos rubbed his star with his thumb until it squeaked. He had never liked the sound. He nodded because nodding delayed choice. "Do what you will," he said. Sloane finished 2 depositions before the sun fell to a kinder angle. He had not reached truth as clean as a spring, but he had found the mud that needed to be stepped through. He stood and stepped out into the glare. "We move at dusk," he told his men. "We escort the nun and the undertaker to the mission to secure the register and the ledger. The rest will hold at the wash." He looked at Tall Wolf. "Your people move where you like. Do not touch the mission. Do not touch my men. Paper will speak at Widow's Eye, if that is where you go." He was making a promise to more than one side. He felt the danger of that in his bones. They broke the tent and tied the packet again. Honora held it close like a sleeping infant. Jonah gathered his ledger from its hiding place and shoved it under his shirt, the paper warm against his belly like guilt. At dusk, they started toward the mission. The sky had turned the color of a bruise healing. Kona wanted to follow close, but Tall Wolf said no with a single soft word. Wait. Waiting was a weapon if used right. Mara walked with Honora and Jonah, and Sloane let them walk a little ahead to keep them from feeling like prisoners. The road to the mission ran between two low ridges, shaped like the back of a sleeping beast. Shadows lay heavy in the cuts, where runoff had bitten the earth when there still had been storms. Half a mile out, something changed in the air, the way a song changes when a fiddle is tuned one notch tighter. Honora smelled lamp oil where no lamp should have been. She broke into a run. Smoke was thin at first, then not. The mission sat gray and low and good against the slope. Its bell was cracked and had been for years. Now the roof above the shelves where records were kept breathed out a dark line, and then a flame, the size of a man's hand, pushed through the shingle like a tongue between teeth. Silas had been quicker than paper. He had brought 3 men who liked not to be named. They had gone in by the back, where the door swelled in rains and did not fit its jam right. They had overturned a shelf and pulled the top layer of ledgers down and left the lower layers lined and waiting like beds for a family. One had lit a match on his boot and held it too long, burning his fingers before he dropped it. The match found oil. Oil found old pages. Fire looked for more of itself and, as always, found it. Honora ran straight into the nave. Heat hit her like a hand. She went to the register first, because you save the thing you can carry before you save the thing too large for any one person. She pulled it from the shelf and hugged it to her chest. Flames ran along the wood and up her sleeve. She slammed her arm into a stone ledge, and the fire died, angry as a cat hissed off a chair. Jonah came in behind her and went to the undertaker's shelf by habit, then remembered his own ledger was already tucked into his shirt. He grabbed loose papers at random, because random truth is still truth when all the careful truth is burning. Sloane and his sergeant beat with their coats and counted their seconds and fell back, coughing, and went again. Amos hovered in the doorway and shouted orders that did not help. Silas stood outside with his hat low and told himself the smoke would look like justice to anyone who did not step close. When they dragged the burning shelf down and stamped it out with boots, Honora turned pages with her trembling fingers and found the one with the scrape. The heat had curled it. The scrape was now a small blister. It made her think of an infant's skinned knee. She set her palm atop it to smooth it, then pulled her hand away fast so the sweat did not smear the remaining ink. She looked at Jonah. He looked at her. The weight of what they had saved and what had gone filled the room like a thick fog. Outside, the sky had gone from bruise to iron. Bugles rose on the far road again, a sound slow and formal, the kind that comes attached to orders written earlier by a man who had not seen the faces under them. Sloane swallowed soot and heard words recited in his head like catechism. Pacify the encampment at Widow's Eye by dawn. He stared at the mission roof, at the curl of black along the eaves, at the register under Honora's arm, at Jonah's shaking hands, at Amos's glittering star, at Silas's blank look, and he knew what would be expected next. He also knew what had just happened would not fit in any report the way reports like to be written. Mara stood in the mission yard with the pouch in her hands and watched a page drift up from the fire and go to ash in the air. A single letter survived long enough for her to read it, a tall, thin line that could have been an I or the backbone of any word that wanted standing. It turned black and vanished. She thought of the boy in the camp with the fever and of the small sound of his breath turning a shade cooler when the cloth had cooled him. She thought of Tall Wolf's face when he had said Atsika in a voice like someone asking forgiveness and saying thanks in the same breath. Kona had followed anyway, against Tall Wolf's word, moving along the shadow line like a fox that knows the trap and wants to see who sets it. She saw the men who ran from the back as the fire took, their faces red and warped by the heat. She saw one was Silas. She went still as a coiled rope. She did not lift her bow. She only memorized the way he moved, the way his foot turned slightly on the left, as if an old injury had never healed right. She slipped back the way she had come and went for Tall Wolf with quiet steps. She trusted her breath to carry the shape of what she had seen. By the time the flames were beaten down to sullen edges and the choir rail had collapsed onto a scatter of black pages, night had come. The kind of night the flats serve, wide and blank and full of listening. Sloane formed the words of the order he had been given and did not say them yet. He looked at the nun, at the undertaker, at the woman with the beaded pouch. He looked at Amos, who could not meet his eyes, and at Silas, whose eyes met everything as if they were nails finding wood. "We move to Widow's Eye," Sloane said at last, and the shape of the world bent toward the spring, like a needle finds true north when iron is near. "We move now. We do this by the book." He did not say whose book. He would find out at the spring. They crossed the flats under a sky full of stars that looked close enough to touch but did not give water. The column was quieter than before. Men who had held buckets and dragged shelves did not care to speak. Honora rode on the wagon seat, with the register wrapped in a blanket at her feet, as if it could catch a chill. Jonah walked beside the wheel, where he could reach and touch the wood when his mind wanted to float away from the ground. Mara walked a little ahead of him. Kona came and went along the flank like a shadow that learned to walk among men who were used to stepping on their own shadows and not noticing. Widow's Eye lay in a basin, ringed by bent cottonwoods and shoulder-high grass, flattened by many thirsty bodies over many years. The spring's surface was dark and flat, a small, perfect circle with the stars in it, like coins. Tall Wolf and his people had come quiet and already melted into positions that used the land's folds. The Comanche did not line up the way soldiers line. They sat where the ground told them to sit. It made a different picture if you looked down from a ridge. It made no picture at all if you did not know what to look for. Sloane halted his men on the near side of a line of rocks that had been stacked to mark an old trail long gone. Silas had been right about one thing. He had come ahead and placed himself in the cottonwoods on the far flank with 2 hands and a piece of chain. He had a preacher waiting within a mile with a book and a prayer, and the broad opinion that God loves order, even when order looks ugly, up close. He watched Mara in the starlight, the way a man watches a stray cow near a gap in a fence, and tells himself he is being a good steward. Tall Wolf stepped out into the open, with nothing in his hands but his hands. He stood where both lines could see him. He spoke first because speaking first is a kind of shaping. "This water is under our breath today. It has been under others' breath. It will be under others' breath after we are not here. We drink without cutting the earth. We leave it able to remember our faces as good. That is the only law that keeps us alive." His words were for Sloane and for Silas, for Amos, and for the boy soldier, whose frown belonged to a child who had not yet learned not to ask why out loud. Sloane pulled the coroner's packet and the depositions and Jonah's ledger from the wagon. He laid them on a crate between 2 rocks, a table the land had made for him. He put a lantern there and lit it and adjusted the flame so it made a steady circle that paper likes. He looked at Mara. "Say what you will to set the ground," he said. He did not notice that his voice had not asked. It had yielded. Mara did not climb anything. She did not raise her hands. She had done enough of that. She stood beside the crate and put the pouch next to the papers. "I was sold at the way station," she said. "I was sold for flour, rye, and a rifle. The undertaker wrote it. He erased a name. He will put it back. The sheriff says rescue and writes words that do not match. The nun kept a name and cut a name to save a life. She will put it back." The coroner heard a voice and wrote that he heard it. That voice was mine. "The woman who died pressed this pouch into my hand. Her husband is here, and he knows the pouch." He fell to his knees when he saw it, because grief does that to a man when it finds the place it was meant to sit. She stopped. She breathed. She looked at the water. "Read first," she said again, for the men who had not heard her in the wash, because their ears had been full of brass. Sloane reached for the packet. The sergeant looked past him into the cottonwoods with a squint, like a man remembering to check the ridgeline after admiring the map too long. Kona felt the air shift and turned her head a fraction. Silas made his move. He stepped from the trees with the length of chain and hissed to his men and went at Mara, the way a man goes at a gate he knows is weak. He did not mean to kill her. He meant to show her and everyone else the shape of her life as he had drawn it in his head, bound and led and sanctified. He did not reach her. Kona's arrow slammed the sleeve of his coat into the cottonwood behind him and pinned him there like a bug going into a collector's case. He swung the chain and cursed. The soldiers half raised their rifles and looked at Sloane. Amos fired wild, the shot biting canvas and sending a puff of dust up from the crate where the papers lay. Jonah threw himself across the coroner's packet like a father over a child. The lantern rocked and almost fell. Sloane grabbed it and set it back, and his hand burned, and he did not drop it. The spring held the stars steady. Tall Wolf did not lift his knife. He laid it on the ground in front of him, point toward himself, the way he had in the wash. "No blood while paper speaks," he said, and the words went across the basin and settled on men's shoulders like a cool cloth. For one wobbling second, the picture held, chain against tree, arrow in sleeve, gun smoke thinning, lantern steady, papers intact, water quiet. Then the sound came again, the sound that had started everything and refused to end. Bugles, nearer now. The specific call that told men we are done speaking and we'll do a simpler thing, because simple is easier to write in reports. The notes bounced off the cottonwoods and came back wrong, like beaks clicking around bone. Sloane closed his eyes and opened them. He had been sent to pacify by Dawn. Dawn was a handful of hours away. Men behind him expected him to do the meaning of that order in the way they had been trained to see it. If you are listening closely, this is where the Undertaker's tiny cross in the ledger margin starts to speak loud enough to be heard over brass. You will see how ink bends a man's hand and a line of soldiers and forces a lawman to write his own name beside the truth he kept from the page. Keep your eye on the cross. It is smaller than a fly's foot, and it will move a mountain by the time the water lifts a single ripple. "Hold," Sloane said, not loud, but his sergeant took it for iron anyway and passed it down the line, the way men pass water to the mouth of a dying mule. "Hold," he said again, louder. "We read." He pointed at Amos with the pen. "You will sign a fresh deposition. You will name the buyer." "I won't," Amos said, and his voice shook like a screen door in a storm. "You will," Jonah said, surprised at himself again, and then he was not surprised. He had been carrying the fear like a sack of grain. He set it down and found he could stand taller without it. Amos shot a glance at Silas pinned to a tree by a woman no taller than his shoulder. He lifted his chin as if to spit, and then did not spit because his mouth had gone dry. He looked at Sloane's pen. He looked at the register in Honora's arms. He looked at the small cross in Jonah's ledger. He looked at the water where the stars held. He said, "Crowley," and the sound of it made all the quiet noises in the basin stop for a half beat, as if a nail had gone into a joist, and every beam in the house had recognized the sound of something finally done, as it should have been done long before. Silas laughed, a high broken sound that did not belong to a man who wins. "Write what you like," he said. "Paper doesn't change thirst." He jerked his arm, and the arrow held him, and he hissed, and then went still. Sloane set the deposition on the crate and wrote the name. He wrote it in a hand larger than he used for anything else. He did not know why. He sanded it, shook the sand away, and passed the sheet to Amos. "Sign," he said. The sheriff signed. His hand made letters that looked like someone learning to write again after a fever. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and left a gray smear across his mustache where soot had stuck to the sweat. Someone on the far ridge, someone late to orders, blew the bugle again. The call came out wrong and then strong. By dawn, the order had said. Dawn would tear the rim in a few hours. The air cooled and made the skin aware of sweat drying. Tall Wolf lifted the pouch and held it a moment, and then set it back beside the papers. He did not take it. He would not take it until the name missing from the register had been put back in its place. He looked at Mara. "You choose your road," he said. It was not the time to answer. It was the time to let the question sit, the way a seed sits before the first drop of water finds it. Across the spring, in the cottonwoods, a preacher, with a book and a prayer, cleared his throat, saw the arrow and the chain, and the lantern, and the page being signed, and shut his book. He did not ride away. He knew a place in a story when a man is not to speak, even if he is a man who has been told all his life that speaking for God is his job. The night leaned on every back the same. The men on the ridge shifted and resettled. The horses breathed and stomped at flies. The lantern flame drew and settled like a living heart. The coroner's packet lay open to the line about the midwife's voice. The parish register waited for a name. The ledger sat quietly and darkly. The wind, which had run so hard these past days, lay down like a tired dog at a porch step and went still. Bugles again, closer, no mistaking. Orders carried by brass, wrapped in sleep and dawn, and the old hunger to end talk with smoke. Sloane set the pen down. He looked from the papers to the men, from the spring to the cottonwoods, from the woman with the pouch to the man who had knelt in the dust. He had chosen to read first. Now he would have to choose what to do with the men who had not. Bugles broke the edge of the night as if the sky itself had a seam and someone was prying it open with brass. The notes came high and hard and answered themselves from the rocks like crows shouting at crows. Sloane did not move for a breath. Then he wrapped his fingers around the lantern handle and set it deeper between the papers, as if light could hold ground. The sergeant raised a hand. The file behind him tightened their grips without lifting barrels. Tall Wolf breathed through his nose and placed his palm on the dirt in front of him, steadying his own blood to match the ground. Mara felt the spring at her back, like a steady eye, watching everyone lie or tell the truth as best they could. The first riders out of the dark were not Sloane's men at all, but night-lean hands of Silas's who had been late to the mission and eager to be first to the next fire. They came at the basin with rope coils, swinging, and a high, ugly sound that was supposed to pass for courage. Amos, already emptied by the name he had signed, shouted something like, "Hold fire," but the words came out shaped like help, and even he did not know which he had meant. One of Silas's hands threw his loop for Mara and missed her by the width of an open palm. The rope fell across the crate and brushed the coroner's packet. The lantern flame fluttered sideways and licked at twine. Jonah slapped it out barehanded and hissed through his teeth. The skin on his palm went slick and white, then pink, then angry red. Kona's second arrow hit the thrower high in the shoulder. He staggered and sat down hard against a cottonwood and swore like a man who has just remembered he is not made only of mouth. The motion drew a flinch in Sloane's line. A private half-sighted down his barrel and then stopped because the sergeant's hand had not moved. Tall Wolf lowered his eyes and kept his knife on the ground between his feet. "No blood while paper speaks," he said again. The words did not sound weaker this time from being repeated. They sounded truer, like a path men's boots had finally worn into the brush. Silas yanked his sleeve off the arrow and stepped forward one drag at a time with the chain, face raw in the lantern light, mouth set on stubborn, the way a child sets his jaw around a lie. "You think a scratch of ink makes a wife?" he said to the air, to God, to anyone with ears. "You think a pouch makes her yours to point at the rest of us?" He swung. The chain sang and caught Mara across the side of her arm. Pain burst white and hot, and she rocked, but did not fall. The pouch slid, and she caught it in both hands and clutched it to her ribs as if catching a baby going off the back of a wagon. Something in Sloane gave way and then held, like ice cracking and freezing harder. "Enough," he said, and his voice carried in a way it never had in a tidy parade ground yard. He stepped between the lines and snatched the chain in mid-swing and wrapped it around his forearm and jerked. Silas came forward off his heels and stumbled so close they breathed one another's breath. "Arrest him," Sloane said, and the sergeant was already moving, men behind him already there, as if the word had only named what their bodies had been waiting to do. 2 rifles crossed Silas's back and pressed him into the cottonwood. The chain fell like a tired snake. Amos tried to find high ground and found only the low fact of what he had done. "Lieutenant," he started, as if titles could float him across water that would drown any other word. Then he saw the look Sloane gave him, not the look of a man who hates you. Those looks are easy to survive, but the look of a man who sees you entire and sets you down in your own shape. Amos stopped speaking. He reached for his star, as if to straighten it, and his fingers would not grip. The star sat crooked and bright and useless. A rider came like a stone, rolled down a hill, too fast, not controlled, with gravity more than decision behind him. He wore a chap with a torn knee and his hat tied down by a string that sawed his chin. He had come to see a fight and take a side when it cost least. He got neither. His horse shied at the lantern and the splash of voices and went hard sideways into the spring. Cold water came up and hit the horse in the belly, and the animal spun. The rider's foot caught in the stirrup. For a breath, the spring was a mirror, with a man's leg scribbled across it like a signature. Tall Wolf moved without moving, hands out, slow, voice low, calming the horse so cleanly that the beast never knew it had been asked not to panic. It simply didn't. The rider sobbed once, high and brief. He freed his foot and sat on the ground, with water soaking his pants to the hip. It was a shame sound, and it cut the circle sharper than anger had. Sloane looked at the crate and at the papers, and felt his orders pressing the dawn against the rim. He had never been the best man in any room. He had always been the man who believed in rooms. He believed in this one now. He set the coroner's page beside Jonah's ledger and Honora's register. "We read," he said again, and this time his own men believed in the word because they had seen him catch chain with his bare arm and not make a noise about it. The sergeant read the coroner's lines aloud, clean and even. He read the ledger entry and said the words, "One woman, exchanged," so that everyone heard each letter land. He held the page up, and the lantern showed the small cross in the margin. A private beside him shifted like a man suddenly remembering his catechism after years of forgetting. "Name," Sloane said to Honora, and she opened the register to the scraped place. The page had wrinkled with heat at the mission, and the blister of thin paper lay like a small cloud over where a word should have been. She set her hand on it, not pressing, only letting it feel her weight. "The mother's name," she said, and said it into the night with no whisper in it. "Atsika, hummingbird." Her voice made the air under the cottonwoods softer for a heartbeat. "We write it back now." She dipped the pen and held it above the line, and for half a second the nib wavered, because her hand knew the feel of scraping a name away, and sometimes a body remembers the wrong thing first. Then she set the point down and wrote. Each letter stood up like a person in a doorway, making themselves known. Jonah stepped closer with the ledger, and his thumb brushed the cross again. He looked at Mara. "I'll put the buyer's name back too," he said, almost apologizing for the delay of years. "I'll write it bolder than anything on the page." He did. The ink looked blacker, as if the paper itself had been waiting to drink that particular word. Crowley. Silas laughed again, a shorter, smaller thing, as if the sound itself had learned it was not welcome. "Write and write," he said. "Water goes where it wants." He thought it was a brave sentence. It was not. It was a man saying the thing that had always served him and finding it dull in his mouth. "Water remembers," Tall Wolf said. "It remembers hands that take with knives. It remembers hands that cup and give." He looked at Mara. The beaded pouch lay beside the register now, beadwork catching the lantern light in small winks, like the eyes of insects at night. "My wife's name is in your mouths," he said. "That is good. Her pouch wants my hands and yours both." He lifted it and turned it once as if testing its weight, and then placed it back on the crate, not keeping it, not sending it away. The horizon grained like tempered steel. Stars faded like writing washed thin on a bill of sale. The time when men who like orders always try to prove their usefulness arrived on cue. From the ridge beyond the basin came the creak and clink of another file of soldiers. Men who had not been at the mission, men who had only the order in their ears, and not the sound of a registry pen on scraped paper. A fresh officer rode at their head, his jacket neat, his eyes small with sleep left in them. He saw 2 lines at a spring. He saw Comanche riders in the grass, and soldiers under a rock line, and a sheriff with soot on his mustache, and a rancher with his sleeve torn by an arrow, and a woman standing beside a crate with papers and a lantern. He did not see a room where anything had been decided. By order from the fort, disperse, he called, big and square. Lay down arms. Disperse, or be fired upon. He had practiced the sentence in his head during the ride, and saved it for first use, and he was not going to waste it on fewer than everyone hearing. He pulled his horse into the bowl of the basin, and his men followed, because following kept you from thinking. Sloan did not move. He had watched the world make him into a man he barely recognized, and then somehow placed the right words in his mouth twice tonight. He tried for a 3rd time. Stand, he told his sergeant, and to the new officer he said, we are in the middle of a legal proceeding. We have a coroner's packet, depositions, a parish register, and a ledger with an erasure restored. Any fire prior to conclusion will be recorded as interfering with witness testimony and chain of custody. The new officer stared. This was not a sentence he had expected. Chain of custody was a thing he liked to write, but only when it led to a clean evening and a drink. He blinked. Your orders said pacify, he said. They did, Sloan answered. And the first way to pacify is to write the truth where it can be read. He did not look back at his own men to see if they approved. He looked at the spring instead, and at the way the dark circle held, even as the sky paled. Silas twisted, and the chain rattled, and the cottonwood leaf tips shook, because the dawn wind had finally remembered how to come. He spat at the dirt, and the spit stuck to his lower lip, and did not quite fall. You're talking pretty to keep from doing the ugly thing, he said. You can dress a rope in silk. It's still a rope. Amos found words again, but they were not the ones he had always used. Silas, he said, and the name sounded wrong in his mouth now, heavy with a cousin to grief. I wrote your name. I did it with my own hand. He looked at the signature he had made an hour ago, and it had already stiffened into something he could not unbend. There's no silk on that. The new officer held up a hand to signal his men to half-level their rifles and look fierce without firing. They did, eager to land somewhere between obedience and delay. He nudged his horse forward 2 steps. The animal's ears flicked at the lantern and the line of paper and the smell of wet leather and old blood in beadwork. He looked at Tall Wolf. You will withdraw, he said. It was supposed to sound generous. Tall Wolf's mouth made the smallest smile, because the word withdraw in a mouth like that was a blade, dull on one side and too sharp on the other. We will drink, he said. We will not cut the earth. We will listen to paper. Then we will go the way we came, and the spring will say, we left nothing behind. Mara spoke before the air could harden again. There is a boy in the camp with fever, she said. If you want to show the spring you are men, bring me clean water in a cup that has not held whiskey, and stand out of the shade while I lay the cloth. Let your rifles watch your pride. Instead of these people, the sentence should not have held power. It did, because it told everyone exactly what to do with their hands. The sergeant moved first, because he had been saved once by a woman with a cloth, and understood a command when he heard it, even if it came without rank. He handed his canteen to Mara, and blinked hard, and called a private by name, and told him to hold the lantern higher. The new officer looked confused, and then self-protective, and then something like human. He grunted something that could be heard as assent. Sloan exhaled through his nose, and the tight line around his mouth slackened 1 notch. Honora opened the register again as Mara bent over the boy. She wrote the addendum line, the way parish women have done for centuries when war and weather force the left hand to learn the right hand's work. Noted witness Mara Vale, child of Atsika, deceased. Father Tall Wolf present, breath given, and breath kept. Jonah wrote a corresponding note in his ledger, in small, careful script, as if each letter might fall and drown otherwise. The boy's fever cracked in that hour, the way sometimes it does when the world is looking and decides to give back a coin it had not meant to spend. He whimpered, then sighed. Then the line of his mouth relaxed enough that you could see the child behind the heat. Kona let her bowstring rest and stood with her hands open so her palms cooled faster. Tall Wolf watched Mara's fingers and put the shape of them in his memory, alongside the unsteady light and his wife's name, made new on the register's page. His face loosened around the eyes, the way a hungry man's face loosens when he hears a spoon against a pot. Silas had found a sliver of iron the world had not taken out of him yet. He flexed and twisted and managed to pull his torn sleeve off the bark. He lunged for Jonah, perhaps because he knew Jonah had made him live on paper in a way that could not be burned out of a knave. He got 3 steps. He did not get 4. Amos moved without planning. He hooked Silas at the knee with a boot and threw a clumsy shoulder. They went down together, choking on dust. Amos came up gasping, hands wide. Silas lay on his side, his mouth full of grit and his eyes wet. He looked not like a man, but like a boy who had lost the shape of his people and blamed anyone within reach. Enough, Sloane said again, and it was not a command this time, but a description that everyone accepted. He called 2 soldiers and had Silas bound proper. He called 2 more and set Amos between them, not because Amos had fought, but because he had signed and then kicked the ground into honesty, and now the ground had the right to take him for a while. The sky broke open along the east. It was not a dramatic break. It was a slow unzipping. Light came in a blade as thin as a hair and widened. The lantern no longer mattered. Papers looked solid in the new day. The spring breathed once, as if the water itself had been tensed, and now relaxed. Vultures coasted wider circles, and then higher, not leaving, only giving space to the living. Tall Wolf bent and lifted the knife he had lain on the ground at the start. He did it so slow that even the new officer did not twitch. He held the knife flat in his palm, blade across his hand, hilt toward Sloane. "We have done as we said," he said. No blood while paper spoke. Sloane did not take the knife because he had nothing to do with it, and because taking a man's tool out of his hand when he hands it to you that way is not how you accept anything worth the weight. He inclined his head once, and Tall Wolf slid the knife back into its sheath, and the earth did not register it as a threat. Mara stood and wiped the boy's forehead one last time, and set the cloth aside, and pressed the back of her own hand to her mouth, because sometimes relief needs a gate. She looked at Tall Wolf. He looked at her. He lifted the pouch and held it to her. "This returns," he said, as if the pouch had its own legs, and had walked back where it needed to be. She wrapped her fingers around it and felt the knots, the odd tight one, the one she had learned with her skin. He did not ask for it, and she did not offer it. It lay between them on the crate then, ownerless and heavier than any coin in the territory. "What road?" Tall Wolf asked. Not loud, not a demand, only the question he had said he would ask when the papers had been read and the water had been respected. Mara looked toward the mission, its eaves blackened, toward the way station that had traded her for flour, toward the fort and its maps, toward the camp where the boy slept now, with a mouth a little open and slack, like a child's again. "I have 2 hands," she said. "One teaches letters, one learns your medicines. If both can work at the same time, I will walk back and forth until the ground knows my steps and doesn't mind them." It was not a speech. It was a plan you could draw on a map with a blunt pencil. Honora made a noise like a woman who has been holding a shawl too tight across her chest and lets it slide off her shoulders. Jonah blinked up at the sky and let his lips mouth a prayer without sound. Sloane pressed the depositions flat and signed his own name where it would make trouble for him later, and he did not look away when he did it. The new officer snorted once like a horse letting go of the first nervous breath of the morning. He holstered his pistol because it looked foolish in daylight beside a crate full of paper. They drank then, not like victors, but like people who had lived through an hour that could have split them and had not. Tall Wolf drank last. He knelt by the spring and cupped water and let it run through his fingers once before he took any. Then he looked at Mara, and for the second time, he went to his knees in the dust. There was no shock in it now, only thanks. He bowed his head and set his knuckles to the ground. He stood again, and the basin breathed with him. They went their ways when the light was full. Sloan put Silas and Amos under guard for escort back to the fort. He left 2 men at the mission to help Honora sort char from pages, and to carry water, and to learn the names of things they had never written down before, because no one had told them they should. Jonah loaded the crate with the ledger and a stack of blistered papers, and set it on the wagon like a coffin, and then laughed once, a dry little bark at himself for thinking of death when his hands were holding something like birth. Kona walked beside Mara and did not say anything for a long while, then said, "The coal you carried over the slot. My grandfather made that test for me too. I dropped my first. He laughed at me kindly and made me go back for another." Mara nodded, because failure and kindness were the 2 hands of most of her days as a teacher. When the basin was nearly empty, Tall Wolf took the pouch from the crate at last and weighed it again, and this time he did not set it back. He pressed it into Mara's hands and closed her fingers around it, not choosing for her, only making certain a choice could be kept. "This belongs to breath," he said. "It is not finished until your heart says it is." He touched the side of his own face near the scar. "When you speak her name, say it like you are making a small fire in a new place. Quiet, with both hands." Mara said it once, clumsy and careful. Atsika. It sounded right enough to live. At the edge of the basin, the preacher waited with his book. He had watched, and not spoken, and learned the taste of silence on his tongue. As Sloan rode past, he lifted 2 fingers not as a blessing, but as a man who is ready to use his one true talent for the good this time, if called. "There's a pen at the mission," Honora told him. "Bring it. We have names to ink before evening." He nodded and turned his horse toward the gray low roof with its blackened teeth. News went out ahead of everyone. It always does. Men at the way station would swear in a week that they had heard the bugles themselves and seen 2 knives laid on the ground. A boy would stand on a water barrel and tell it to passers-by, while his mother shushed him and smiled behind her hand. Out on the flats, a ranch hand who had ridden hard and then nowhere would tell a coyote under his breath at midnight that paper had beaten iron for once, and that he did not know what to do with that knowledge, except drink less mean and spit less often. By afternoon, the mission's nave smelled of steam and char and wet ash. Honora laid pages flat with stone weights and strung twine for drying. Jonah copied the ledger line into a bound book, then took the old ledger and wrote under his cross, in letters smaller than any he had set down in his life. "The cross is to mark a coward's erasure and a small man's courage found late." He set the pen aside and wept against the back of his hand. Not loud, not long, enough. Sloan wrote his report with a new hand. He described the coroner's packet, the ledger, and the register. He described the sheriff's deposition, and the buyer's name was restored. He described a chief who laid down a knife and a woman who said, "Read first." He wrote the word pacify, and then wrote what it meant for once. He did not write the wrong thing, because it would have made his days easier. He wrote the right thing, because his nights had been too long already. Mara set a school slate on a crate in the mission yard and drew letters with a stub of chalk. Children came, and Kona watched from the shade and pretended she was only guarding. Tall Wolf stood with his arms loose and his hands empty and tried to remember the last time his shoulders had not been pulled high by grief. He could not remember exactly, so he memorized this hour to use later. On the second morning after the spring, wind came out of the north and was cool enough you could feel hope stand up without shame. Mara walked between the mission and the camp as the sun climbed, feet finding a path that had not been there yesterday and would be obvious tomorrow. She carried herbs wrapped in cloth one way and a kerosene tin scrubbed clean the other. On a low bench inside the mission, she opened the pouch and took out a small bit of folded hide with 3 seeds caught in it like thoughts. She had not known the seeds were there. She did not know what they were yet. She wrapped them again and set them back, because not every discovery needs to be planted the day you find it. Sloane sent Silas under guard toward a judge who liked papers more than men. He let Amos ride beside, unbound, because there are chains that show and chains that do not, and it is good for a man sometimes to feel both. As they left the flats, Amos looked back once, not at the fort, but at the mission, and the basin, and the line the water had left on the cottonwoods in a year, when the spring had run high. He touched his crooked star, and did not straighten it. That evening, when the lamps burned low, and the nave breathed out the warm damp of day's work, Honora opened the register to the line she had written, and spoke the names into the room. Soft, she set the book down beside the undertaker's ledger, as if laying two hands next to one another to show they belonged to the same body. Jonah added a final note in his tidy way, small and exact, witnessed by the undersigned, that the erasure was restored, and the buyer named. He looked at the tiny cross again, and almost rubbed it away in foolishness, then left it. Men should be able to see where their hands shook, and set themselves to steadier work after. The last of the army left Widow's Eye at dusk. Sloane rode out last. He stopped his horse at the basin's lip, turned in the saddle and looked long, so he would not have to look again. He tipped his hat at no one. Then he followed his men along the hard track, where wheels and hooves had bruised the ground for years and would for years more. Mara and Tall Wolf stood where the crate had been. The ground still showed the square in the dust where the lantern had rested, and where the papers had made a small room in the clean air. They did not speak. They did not need to. The spring spoke enough for a dozen people, quiet, steady, a thread of sound a person could tie their day to. When night came soft for the first time in weeks, the stars settled into the spring again. Tall Wolf knelt once more, not for a show and not for grief, and touched the water and touched the dirt and stood. He pressed his fist to his chest and then opened his hand toward Mara. She did the same. It was a small ceremony that paid a life debt without turning a person into property. It would have looked like nothing to a passerby. It was the only shape large enough to hold what had been done. If you have kept your eye on the undertaker's tiny cross in the ledger margin, you have seen how a mark smaller than a fly's foot made a sheriff sign his own name beside a truth, made a lieutenant write a report that cost him ease, made a rancher stop laughing long enough to be led in irons, and made a spring hold peace until dawn arrived. Should the ledger speak again, you'll know which page to open first.